No one was more aware of Ottoman decline than the Sultan Selman III. He reigned from 1789 to 1807. He saw what was going on in France. He saw a king try to institute reform. He saw local resistance, elite resistance, popular resistance turn into revolt. He believed he needed to be an enlightened despot. He needed to adopt some of the ideas coming out of the Enlightenment in order to update his government, his kingdom, his empire in a way that was rational, that solved problems. The Arabic word for this is Nizam-e-Jadid. It generally means a new order, a new way of doing things. Selman's reforms addressed the challenges he had at the time. Those challenges included janissary exploitation, that the janissaries no longer served as military guardians of the Sultan's empire. Instead, they used their titles, their position, their office to exploit local populations and get rich. He faced an invasion by Napoleon. 1799, Napoleon invaded and went down the Nile River Valley. This was incredibly disruptive to the Sultan because it showed his vulnerability, his weakness. He had no way to defend his empire. He was at the mercy of local warlords. He had spent the previous 100 years, or his ancestors had spent the previous 100 years, concentrated on the border with the Habsburgs. And now all of a sudden there is a danger down in the southeastern part of the empire. That was compounded by an Islamic threat out of Arabia. A group of Islamic fundamentalists referred to as Wahhabis, following a local religious theologian who wanted to purify Islam, believing that Islam had compromised too much with contemporary culture and contemporary society, that Islam had gotten weak and was failing. And so the Wahhabis wanted to impose on society a godly kingdom, much in the same way that the Puritans in England did during the English Civil War. All of these issues compounded each other to contribute to Ottoman decline, or to illustrate or magnify Ottoman decline. So Selman instituted this new order, which included Westernization, looking towards the West to find ways to improve his government, looking to the Enlightenment and ideas coming out of Western Europe to make his position stronger. One of the things that meant was professionalization. Selman wanted to promote people based on merit rather than birth. Selman wanted to promote people based on merit and service to him rather than their local connections or their family connections. Westernization also meant relying on a conscript army. So instead of using the janissaries, he tried to create a peasant army coming out of ethnic Turks. These people would no longer be as slaves, but he would go and recruit them, conscript them from Turkish populations, and believing they would then defend the Turkish Empire against outside threats, and they would answer to him, not a local pusha, not a local notable. He needed an independent army for himself that could provide both internal order and defend against external threats. To do that, he needed money. And so he instituted tax and land reform. Land reform meant taking back tamars. Tamars were a local fief. This was a common way of compensating military service during what we generally call the Middle Ages. Instead of providing people with cash, we provide them with land. Theoretically, in the Ottoman Empire, that land was supposed to go back to the Sultan on death, and then could be redistributed depending upon who else steps up in terms of service. Those that held these tamars then started thinking them as hereditary in the same way that European nobles thought of their land holdings as hereditary, which meant that many of the people who held these fiefs had never served the Sultan, never served in his military, never served in his government. And so the Sultan simply said, "You're not in service, the land is mine, give it back." He instituted a wool and alcohol tax, trying to find ways to raise money. That peasant army needs musket, that peasant army needs uniform, that peasant army needs to be supplied with food, with clothing, with shelter. The only way to do that is to find a new tax to raise money. He doesn't want to be dependent upon local tax collectors for that. And so he needs to create a new centralized system of taxation. That new system of taxation included tariffs, taxes on products moving both in and out of the empire and around the empire. All of this was meant to reinstitute or re-solidify his own personal rule. He wanted people to answer to him. He wanted the money to flow into him so that he could reestablish the centralized strength that had been eroded during the 18th century. What he wasn't ready for and wasn't prepared for was a backlash. The Janissary Corps led a coup in 1807. The Janissaries rose up in rebellion. They arrested him, threw him in jail, replaced him with a new sultan, Mustafa IV. But that coup was so unpopular. The Janissaries were so hated that it produced a second coup in 1808, producing Muhammad II. He was a relative of Selman, and as you can see from the picture, he adopts this same process of westernization, including, right, modeling his dress on European military leaders at the turn of the century. Not completely, right? Still wearing some traditional garments, some traditional robes, but making sure that he's going to update the Ottoman Turk rule, reform Ottoman Turk rule so that they can stay in power. That was a tall order. There's really no way to get that big of reform passed in 10 years and create a solid enough foundation for the continuation of despotic rule. there was still a tremendous amount of elite opposition, elite resistance to Ottoman rule. The weakness of the Sultan's rule was felt most on the border, in the borderlands. For example, in Serbia, between 1804 and 1815, there was a rebellion against Ottoman rule. This was started because of land seizures. Rogue elements of the Janissary Corps started seizing land from local Serbs. They eventually massacred a group of Serbs. This rogue group of Janissaries are called the Dahi. And the Dahi massacre in 1804 then triggered a response, a violent response against the Janissaries and against the Sultan. This eventually led to a more organized resistance by the Ayan, right, the local notables, who led not one, but two uprisings against Turkish rule. They were so successful at driving away imperial troops or imperial armies that the Sultan granted Serbia a principality status within the empire. That means that they were inside the empire, but the rulers of Serbia were princes in the empire and ruled as an autonomous unit. They did not have to answer to imperial authorities. This is one step away from breaking completely away from Sultan's rule. Another area where the Sultan faced local resistance was in Greece between 1821 and 1829. This time, the rebellion was led by Theodoros Kallikratronis. He was from a famous local family, a local dignitary, and he used those local connections to resist Ottoman rule. The Sultan was still not in a position to do anything about it, so he called upon Muhammad Ali, the Pasha of Egypt, to intervene in Greece. Muhammad Ali sent his son Ibrahim over to Greece. He had success on the island of Crete. He had success on the Peloponnesus, and he looked like he was in a position of reining in these Greek rebels. Unfortunately for the Sultan, the Russians, the British, the French all intervened in 1827 and pushed Egyptian forces out of Greece. All of the great powers then met in London in 1830, negotiating a settlement which ended with Greek independence. Unlike Serbia, that remained within the Ottoman Empire, the great powers demanded that Greece be an independent kingdom, and then defined what the borders were going to be, and also defined who the ruler would be. The great powers decided that Prince Otto of Bavaria would be king of Greece. Now you say, well, why Otto of Bavaria? Where did he come from? Well, he traced his family lineage, right, his dynasty, back to a Byzantine, right, a Christian Byzantine emperor in 1375. He spoke German, he was ethnically German, had nothing to do with the Greeks. So technically, this is still within the Congress of Vienna's concept of, quote, restoration. That it had been in the family, right? This territory had been in Otto's family, and now they're just restoring it back to him. They're not doing anything novel. The Sultan was in no position to negotiate. He had to accept this and lost his territory to a new independent king of Greece. That opened the door then to events in Egypt, because Muhammad Ali, Pasha of Egypt, literally just witnessed the breakaway of the Serbs, the breakaway of the Greeks, right? Local leaders in Serbia, local leaders in Greece, successfully walling themselves from imperial authority. He had been the one that recaptured Egypt from Napoleon. He had been the one that had pushed back the Wahhabis in Arabia. He didn't rely on any help from the Sultan. He did it himself. And so he used that position to push towards Constantinople. And he moved through the Levant, moving up through Syria, moving up into Asia Minor. And once again, it looks like that campaign was going to put an end to Ottoman rule altogether, and a new dynasty would come into power. Once again, the great powers intervened. Great Britain, Austria-Hungary, Prussia, Russia, none of them wanted to see a revitalized Islamic ruler in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And so they came together in 1840 and told Muhammad Ali, stop, don't go any further. And so he had to pull back. He did extract for himself hereditary rule so that his son could inherit Egypt. It wouldn't return back to the Sultan. The Sultan had to accept that Muhammad Ali's family basically controlled Egypt. And it also then set the borders of what between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan regained territories like Syria and basically forced Muhammad Ali to retreat back into Egypt, reestablishing the status quo. All of this together shows that the Ottoman reform package that began under Selman didn't have enough oomph to protect the Sultan's rule. The Sultan stayed on the throne because of people like Muhammad Ali. And then, ironically, he stayed on the throne because of the intervention of the great powers. A person or an office that had such a big head start in centralization in firearms technology found itself in a weakened position at the beginning of the 19th century because it lost its centralization, it lost its monopoly of firearms. And that loss of centralization, that loss of firearms, threatened its survival as a state.